This slide series is done in memory of Dr. Edward Ross Ritvo, who passed away in June of 2020 at the age of 90 years. A pioneer in autism research, he led the field in establishing that autism was neurobiologically based. A graduate of Harvard and a U.S. Army veteran, he spent his entire academic professional career at UCLA. His work included studies of diagnosis and classification, genetics and epidemiology, as well as neurobiology and psychopharmacology. He trained generations of leaders in the field and is survived by family members and many, many students. It's an honor to dedicate this series of talks to his memory with the support of Dr. Ariella Riva Ritvo Slifka and the Alan B. Slifka Foundation.
Hello, and welcome to the Center of Excellence on Autism Spectrum Disorders at Southern Connecticut State University's Professional Educator Training Series. This video is on an introduction to learning, and my name is Dr. Meghan Brahm. I'm a board-certified behavior analyst and assistant professor at Southern Connecticut, as well as a center team member. The objectives for today's discussion is to gain a brief understanding of what learning is and to discuss the process of learning, to gain an understanding of factors which impact learning particular to an educational environment, and to introduce some of the principles of learning. Let's get some terminology down first. So when we talk about learning, what we're talking about is a long-lasting change in behavior or the ability to behave in a certain or in a given way. Also, you'll see an acronym SPED, which stands for special education. So back to learning. As we said, learning is a long-lasting change in behavior or the ability to behave in a certain way. So behavior is a phenomenon that has been studied for over 100 years, and we're going to see some of the seminal research in learning in just a little bit. Learning involves acquiring and changing knowledge, skills, strategies, beliefs, attitudes, behaviors, etc. So it involves being able to change those things because we have acquired new abilities. Learning is important because as we learn, we grow as individuals. We get access to new and different opportunities that we would not have had prior to learning new skills or behaviors or knowledge. We increase our self-esteem. We are able to make day-to-day activities easier. We enhance our lives, and through the enhancement of our lives, we get increased social interactions and opportunities, and we're able to stay up to date in an ever-changing world. Now, relevance particular to autism in school settings, teaching and learning is something that really needs to be intentionally designed, and it needs to be intentionally designed and intentionally implemented, particularly by considering the principles of learning that we're going to start to talk about today. So both teaching and learning are strategies that need to be considerate of learning as a whole. We need to understand how the principles of learning can aid learners who have not been successful in general education settings. Particular to individuals with autism spectrum disorders in school environments, we need to remember that learning and teaching are processes that require different supports within special education. We know that individuals with autism access special education services because they acquire and they utilize information differently than their neurotypical peers. We also need to ensure that we're specifically programming for these things. Some examples of the way in which individuals with autism spectrum disorders in schools might need a different approach to teaching and learning is that they might need more or less of something that we can provide for them. So as an example, they might need more time, they might need more modeling, more reinforcement, less verbal instruction, and potentially more visual instruction. They might need more opportunities to practice skills. They might need skills or assignments more broken down, or in other words, less dense work. They might need more help with error correction, and so on and so forth. We also need to be considerate of characteristics of learning. So learning should produce a change in behavior over time, and we understand that that change should be relatively permanent. We understand that learning is adaptable and is selective, so meaning it should be generalizable. And we also understand that learning results from practice, repetition, experience, and reinforcement. Those are the principles of learning that we're going to start getting a little bit more into now. So here we have 8 principles of learning. It's important to note, though, that these are not the only principles of learning that exist, but these are selected because they're particularly relevant to educating individuals with autism in school. The first principle, or other words called law of learning, that we are going to talk about is the concept of readiness. So readiness is talked about in a number of different philosophical realms, and it refers to what we say as the learner being best able to learn when they are physically, mentally, and emotionally, quote, ready. Well, one of the things that's important to remember about an autism spectrum disorder is that it is a developmental disability. So what we know is that our learners who are in our classrooms or in our settings educationally will not be at the same developmental standpoint as their neurotypical peers. And so it actually is quite important to talk about readiness with regard to autism, because in a neurotypical environment, you may sit back and you may wait for the phenomena of readiness to occur. That is not successful for individuals with autism. Rather, it is our job, it is our duty to ensure that we are supporting readiness in our learners and aiding them in being ready to learn whatever it is most appropriate for their educational practice. We need to also understand that individuals may not see a reason for learning if there is no readiness being helped. The readiness concept and the seeing a reason for learning directly relates to concentration and motivation. So we really need to understand that ensuring that learners have what we call prior knowledge, and is our next principle of learning, is so important for readiness. We have to program specifically for readiness for individuals with autism. We should not sit back and wait for it to occur. So moving on to prior knowledge, as we just started talking about, prior knowledge is having a starting point or some root or some knowledge repertoire in order to build upon. So every individual needs to have some sort of repertoire in order to build upon and gain additional skills. Consider prior knowledge as building blocks for learning. So one of the things that we need to really consider with regard to autism is that the learners we may work with have what's called splinter skills, or may have what's called splinter skills. So splinter skills refers to having a particular set of skills that may not be functionally related to the individual's overall ability. So it is really important when considering the principle of learning called prior knowledge to ensure that we are assessing prior knowledge, and we are selecting assessments that directly test prior knowledge before we expect a new skill to come about, or before we try and teach something new. Prior knowledge is really important to understand because without a solid foundation, it is unlikely that our individuals are going to be able to build a skill as useful as they need it to be. So let's think about an example of prior knowledge. If we think about the requirements for completing a math problem, there are a number of different skills that are required in terms of prior knowledge to complete a math problem. Here's just a sample of some. So we need to be able to identify numbers. We need to know number quantity. We need to be able to read and write. We need to have attending skills, and we need to understand the math function that's being asked. So whether it's addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, whatever it may be. So in order to expect an individual to be able to learn math problems, we need to realize that they must have all of those prerequisite skills and then some already in their behavioral repertoire, meaning they already understand how to do those things. If there is a skill missing, even if it's a skill that's quite below where they may be functioning grade level or content-wise, it is likely that they're still going to struggle with that particular learning opportunity that is in front of them. One of the ways by which we increase prior knowledge and we help with regard to readiness is through practice. So the law of practice states that the things that are most often repeated are best remembered. So we need to always program for the opportunity for our learners to practice as much as possible. Students learn best and they retain the most amount of information for the longest periods of time when they have practice opportunities and repetition that span time. So not just practice opportunities and repetition at the moment of learning or at the opportunity of learning, but also across time to ensure those skills or that new knowledge is being maintained and generalized across time. Best practice in learning states that it must be meaningful and it must lead to something called reinforcement, which is a learning principle that we're going to get to in just a moment. But in terms of meaningful, what we're talking about there is the concept that an individual can interact with and can relate to the materials that are being used or the concepts that are being used. And so we really want to strive to really consider our students and our individuals' preferences and strengths when giving practice opportunities for new skills. Reinforcement. So reinforcement is also called or referred to as the law of effect or the principle of effect. And it was initially studied by Thorndike back in 1898. So what we know over decades and decades and decades of studying reinforcement is unequivocally that learning is strengthened when it's followed by a pleasant or a satisfying outcome. And importantly, that satisfying or pleasant outcome needs to be identified by the learner. So we as the adults are not identifying what is pleasant or satisfying for an individual. Rather, they are identifying it for us. We also understand that learning is weakened when it's followed by an unpleasant outcome. So when considering reinforcement and how that affects learning, we need to remember that every single learning experience should contain elements or should have some sort of outcome that leaves the learner with something positive at the end. Pleasant and unpleasant, like we said, are determined by the learner or by the student, not by our own interpretation or our own assumptions. We also need to remember that the outcome of reinforcement directly relates to motivation. And as we talked about, motivation relates to readiness. So we can see here that all of these principles of learning are starting to get cyclical, meaning that they all relate back to each other and they create the process of learning. The law of primacy talks about the state of being first. And so what we understand with primacy is that it creates a strong association that is very, very difficult to change. So what we know is that things that are learned first persist best over time. And so why this is particularly relevant in a discussion about teaching for autism spectrum disorders is with regard to autism spectrum disorders, we know that primacy is very, very difficult to so-called undo. So when we're teaching, we need to be absolutely sure that we are teaching procedurally correct and that we are giving the opportunity for correct responses the first time, because when errors are made, particularly for individuals with autism, they are very hard to correct. So really considering primacy and the state of being first, or what an individual learns first, is really important when we're designing teaching strategies. Related to primacy is the consideration or the law of recency. This states that most things that are most recently learned are the best remembered. So if we think about the example, and there's multiple examples that we can think about here, but if we think about a very commonly given example when we talk about recency, we can say that it's fairly easy to recall a telephone number that we may have dialed a few minutes ago. But it's very, very difficult for most of us to recall a phone number that we dialed last week. Same as directions, we can think of as recency. It's very hard to remember a place that we went to, say, a month or a year ago, but it's probably quite easy to remember somewhere that we may have driven to this morning. So recency refers to the fact that we need to consider how our learning process and how our teaching procedures are ordered in order for the individual to learn best. Recency is especially pronounced in children. And so when we are talking about programming for individuals with autism, we need to remember that in the individuals who are in school age grades, recency is going to be an especial consideration. The next law of learning or principle of learning that we're going to talk about is saliency or intensity. These are interchangeable. So when we talk about intensity or saliency, we're specifically talking about the intensity or saliency of the stimuli or the materials that we are using to teach. So we know that the more meaningful or the more relatable a material or a stimuli is that we're using to teach, the more likely the student is to learn from that particular material. Let's talk about the example on the right. The example on the right talks about how a student can acquire more understanding, more appreciation, and therefore more learning from watching a movie of something as compared to reading a script. So the visual input from watching a movie is more salient or more intense, if you will, than it would be as compared to reading a script. Lastly, we're going to talk about the learning environment. So when we talk about environment, what we mean is quite literally everything that surrounds an instance of learning. So these can be anything in the classroom, in the gym, in the cafeteria, in the library, whatever it is that's surrounding us. It can be sounds, smells, particular people present or absent, bright colored stimuli on the walls. And if we think about classrooms or educational environments in general, they tend to be very brightly colored and very stimulating. They can be noises that we may not hear, but other individuals may. So we really need to be considering everything in the learning environment. The learning environment is often overlooked and really needs careful consideration in terms of understanding the strengths and challenges of the learners that we're working with and structuring the environment such that they have the least amount of distractions or the least barriers present in order to be as successful as possible. We also want to consider the learning environment with regard to all of the principles of learning that we have already talked about. So all of those principles that we've discussed so far all come together to create a learning environment. And if we have not programmed for and therefore taught those principles of readiness effectively, then our learning environment can often be quite challenging. Let's talk about a case study. So Kian, our hypothetical student, is a 4th grader who's been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder and has a one-to-one paraprofessional in his school. Kian has been exhibiting challenging behavior during math time. The staff, therefore, have been quite concerned about the increase in challenging behavior, and so they have implemented a policy with Kian which states that he must complete his math work before he can go to music class. And music class is one of the things that he prefers most or really enjoys in the day. Let's think about how the learning principles cycle and how that affects Kian and what questions we need to ask in order to ensure that learning principles are being utilized most effectively with Kian. So when we look at Kian's learning environment, we need to ask questions that directly relate to all of the principles of learning. So we need to ask questions about his readiness. So does he have the ability to ask for help functionally if he needs it? Does he have the ability to complete what we're asking him to complete, which directly relates to prior knowledge? Does he have those math skills, prior knowledge asks? Are there gap skills in his profile that need to be targeted first before we can expect him to complete what's being asked of him? Are we giving him enough practice opportunities, or does he need more opportunity to practice particular sets of math skills? Is he accessing reinforcement, and have we effectively programmed for reinforcement? So is he accessing a positive outcome when he practices these math skills or not? Then we think about primacy and recency together. So have we individualized his math worksheets to ensure that the concept of primacy and recency are embedded within all of the practice that he's accessing? And then lastly, what materials are we using? Are we ensuring that there's intensity and saliency in the materials with which Kian is learning math? So you can see that all of these principles of learning relate to each other, and they all work together to create Kian's learning environment. They all need to be considered, and they all need to be programmed for to ensure best practice when teaching individuals with autism. The take-home message here is that there are multiple principles of learning, even more than we have time for here, like we talked about at the beginning, but really important to consider that they all work together to create a learning repertoire or a learning environment for a student. We need to consider all aspects of learning when we are creating a program for a student, and we need to continuously evaluate whether or not the aspects we have in place are useful or functional or having their intended purpose. To learn more about some of the other concepts that were talked about in today's presentation, please feel free to watch the video series number 3 on reinforcement essentials, number 4 on the importance of consistency, and number 8 on prompting. Thanks very much. We appreciate your time, and we would also appreciate your support. Contributions can be made through our website, which is linked below. For more information about the Autism Center at Southern, please feel free to also go to our website. And for more reading, please see the reference list here.